The Second World War was a battle not only of nations but of will. It was fought not just by generals and governments, but by ordinary men thrust into extraordinary situations. Men who, in moments of chaos, were forced to choose between obedience and instinct. This is the story of one such man, an Australian soldier whose decision to defy a direct order would ripple through the sands of North Africa and change the course of World War II. His name was Thomas Currie diver Derrick. Born in the dusty suburbs of Adelaide, he wasn't a scholar nor a soldier by birth. He was a working man, a fighter in spirit, and a thinker in action. When the world plunged into war, he became the embodiment of the Australian fighting spirit: tough, loyal, defiant, and unpredictable. And in one crucial moment, when discipline demanded obedience, Derrick did the unthinkable. He disobeyed. That single decision would spark a chain reaction that helped destroy Rommel's Afrika Korps and turn the tide of the Desert War. But to understand why and how one man's choice could change a world at war, we must go back to where it all began, to the deserts of North Africa, and to a generation of Australians who refused to bow. The birth of the 9th Division, the Australian Imperial Force, the AIF, was reformed in 1939, after the horrors of the First World War still echoed through the land. For many Australians, the new war was not about empire or conquest. It was about defending freedom and proving that a small nation, half a world away, could stand shoulder to shoulder with giants. Among these recruits came farmers from Queensland, miners from Broken Hill, mechanics from Sydney, and one lanky, sharp-eyed man from South Australia named Tom Derrick. He was already in his late 20s, older than most of the boys who volunteered. He'd worked hard all his life on farms, railways, and vineyards, a man hardened by labor but softened by humor. He was known among friends as Diver, a nickname from his time working at the Port River. When Derrick joined the 2 over 48th Battalion, he didn't look like a hero. He looked like any Australian sunburn, relaxed, with that easygoing grin. But beneath the grin was a mind that refused to be ordinary. The Australian way of war. The Australians were different. They didn't march like the British. They didn't salute like clockwork. They swore, joked, and disobeyed minor orders with casual indifference. To the British officers, they seemed chaotic, colonial cowboys. But on the battlefield, that chaos became creativity. They didn't freeze when the plan broke down, they adapted. They didn't fear authority, they questioned it. And when faced with death, they laughed in its face. This attitude made them invaluable in the desert, where rigid tactics often failed, and initiative meant survival. By 1941, the 9th Division had gained a reputation that both impressed and unnerved their allies. They had become the backbone of the Allied defense in North Africa and the nightmare of Rommel's forces. They had already earned fame during the siege of Tobruk, holding the fortress city against constant bombardment and attack for 242 days. British officers called them the Rats of Tobruk, and rather than take offense, the Australians adopted the name proudly. Because rats survive and they bite back. Diver Derrick's rise. During the siege, Derrick began to shine. He wasn't reckless, but he had a calmness under fire that inspired his men. He would smile even under bombardment, cracking jokes, sharing rations, keeping morale alive when everything seemed lost. His leadership wasn't about rank. It was about trust. If Derrick said a position could be taken, his men believed him and followed him. By the end of Tobruk, he had already been wounded, decorated, and promoted to sergeant. He had proven that he wasn't just brave, he was brilliant. He understood that wars weren't won by waiting for orders. They were won by men who acted, and soon the world would see just how far that belief could go. The Desert Fox. In 1942, the Allied command faced their most cunning enemy, Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox. He was a master of maneuver, deception, and timing. His Afrika Korps moved like a blade through sand, precise and unpredictable. Rommel knew the desert better than anyone. He understood how to hide armor behind dunes, how to strike from the sun, and how to vanish before counterattack. By mid-1942, his army had driven deep into Egypt. The British 8th Army was battered and retreating. If Rommel reached the Suez Canal, the Middle East, and possibly the entire Allied war effort could collapse. The British brought in a new commander, Bernard Montgomery, a man obsessed with order, planning, and discipline. He began rebuilding morale and supplies, preparing for one massive, decisive battle. That battle would take place at a remote railway stop in Egypt called El Alamein. The Australians' role? Montgomery's grand plan required precision. Every division had its place. Every advance had a schedule. He expected absolute obedience. But among his most important units and his most unpredictable were the Australians of the 9th Division. They were assigned to the northern sector, near the coast, a region critical for Rommel's observation posts and artillery lines. Their task was simple in writing, but brutal in reality. Break the enemy's flank. Draw Rommel's attention north, while the British prepared to strike in the center. In late October 1942, the sand shook as the 8th Army unleashed a barrage of artillery, the beginning of the Second Battle of El Alamein. The sky burned with light. The earth roared. And in the middle of that inferno stood Sergeant Tom Derrick and his men. Their orders were strict advance only when the command gives the word. But in war, even the best plans disintegrate. And soon Derrick would face a choice that no soldier should ever have to make. The stalled advance. As the battle raged into its second night, the Australians pushed forward through minefields and shell fire. Every step was agony, the sand littered with twisted metal and burning trucks. Casualties were rising. The enemy was holding. At one key position, Hill 33, a rocky outcrop overlooking the battlefield, German machine gunners had pinned down entire platoons. Orders came through the radio, hold your position, reinforcements are coming. But the reinforcements never came. The line was collapsing. Derrick's platoon was trapped in open ground, under relentless fire. Men were bleeding out in the sand, unable to move. Waiting for orders meant death. And that's when Derrick did something extraordinary. He looked at the ridge ahead, bristling with enemy guns, and made a decision that would defy command, logic, and fear itself. In that moment, history held its breath. Would he obey the chain of command, or would he follow his own instinct and possibly change the outcome of the war? Derrick took one final look at his men. Then he spoke 5 words that would echo through history. We take that hill now. The moment of defiance, the air was thick with smoke and dust. The crack of machine guns echoed through the desert night. Flashes of tracer fire cutting through the darkness. All around Sergeant Thomas Diver Derrick, the world was chaos, wounded men crying for medics, shells bursting in the dunes, radio calls drowned by static, and then came the silence. That dreadful pause before a decision that would change everything. Derrick crouched low behind a mound of sand. He looked back at his platoon, exhausted, bleeding, but watching him, waiting. Orders were clear. Hold your position. Do not advance until reinforcements arrive. But Derrick knew what that meant. It meant more waiting, more dying. He could see the German positions, lines of bunkers dug into the hill, machine guns blazing from behind stone walls, and mortars zeroed in perfectly. If they didn't move now, his men would be wiped out before sunrise. He spat into the sand, adjusted his helmet, and said it again quietly this time. We take that hill, now. No permission, no backup, just raw courage. The assault begins. Derrick led the charge himself, sprinting forward under a hail of bullets, tossing grenades with pinpoint accuracy. He moved like a ghost through the night, his silhouette barely visible against the moonlit dunes. Each explosion lit the desert in brief, blinding flashes, revealing a figure climbing, crawling, advancing where no sane man would go. He climbed the rocky slope of Hill 33 alone at first, then with his men following behind, inspired by his madness. They weren't supposed to move, but when Diver moved, everyone moved. Grenades arced through the air. Machine guns fell silent one by one. The Australians surged upward, bayonets fixed, shouting war cries into the night. By dawn, they had taken the first line of bunkers, then the second, then the third. In less than an hour, they captured a position that had withstood 2 days of British assaults. Disobeying command saving the battle. When the command finally radioed in, the operator's voice was sharp with disbelief. Who authorized that attack? A soldier replied simply, Diver did. The reply came back furious. He wasn't supposed to move. He could have jeopardized the operation, but Derrick had done the opposite. By capturing Hill 33, he had opened a critical gap in Rommel's northern defenses. From that height, Australian gunners now had a perfect line of sight into enemy supply routes and artillery nests. British commanders quickly realized the impossible had happened. An unauthorized Australian assault had just cracked the German flank wide open. What was supposed to be a holding position had become a turning point. Montgomery's staff initially reprimanded the Australians for acting without orders, until intelligence reports came in showing that Rommel's entire northern line was beginning to collapse. Derrick's disobedience had forced Rommel to divert reserves north, weakening his central defense. That shift allowed Montgomery to launch Operation Supercharge, the final push that shattered the Afrika Korps. Within days, the tide of the North African campaign had turned, and it all began with one Australian sergeant who refused to wait for permission to win. After the battle, when the smoke cleared, Hill 33 was a graveyard of twisted metal, shell holes, and silence. Derrick's platoon had suffered heavy losses, but they held the ground. His men later said they'd never seen anything like it. He had taken out 10 machine gun posts and dozens of enemy soldiers almost single-handedly. He moved methodically, clearing bunkers with grenades, then charging in to finish the job. When asked later why he did it, Derrick gave his usual dry smile and said, "It seemed a shame to let good ground go to waste." That line would go down in military legend. For his actions at El Alamein, Derrick was recommended for the Distinguished Conduct Medal, which he received soon after. But those who served under him believed he deserved far more. They were right, though. The greatest honor was still to come. The soldier who changed the desert war. The Battle of El Alamein ended with Rommel's retreat. For the first time, the Allies had stopped the Desert Fox, and the war began to shift in their favor. Montgomery called it the turning point of World War II. Churchill later declared, "Before Alamein, we never had a victory. After Alamein, we never had a defeat." Few outside the front lines ever knew that an Australian sergeant defying orders had played a key role in that victory. But among the 9th Division, it was never forgotten. Derrick became a living legend, the soldier who dared to disobey, not out of arrogance, but out of instinct, courage, and a refusal to watch his men die needlessly. He had proven something timeless, that sometimes leadership means breaking the rules, when the rules no longer make sense. The legend grows. After North Africa, the 9th Division was sent to the Pacific to fight the Japanese in New Guinea, a jungle war far removed from the deserts of Egypt. And once again, Derrick would make history. In 1943, during the battle for Saddleburg Ridge, he performed an even more astonishing feat, scaling a near vertical cliff under heavy fire, taking out enemy positions one by one. For that, he received the Victoria Cross, the British Commonwealth's highest award for valor. It was rare enough to win one high honor and a lifetime rarer, still to earn both the DCM and the VC. Only a handful of men in history had done both. The meaning of defiance. To the military establishment, Diver Derrick was an enigma. He obeyed orders until those orders put lives at risk. He respected command until command failed to see the reality of battle. He once said, "Sometimes the only way to win a fight is to ignore the book and follow your gut." In El Alamein, that gut instinct had helped tip the balance of a global war. It showed that initiative, courage, and a touch of rebellion could change history. The final battle. In 1945, Derrick was fighting in Borneo when he was struck by machine gun fire. Even as medics tried to carry him back, he refused to stop giving orders. He died days later, just months before the war ended. He was 33 years old, but his legend lived on not just in medals or citations, but in every soldier who learned that courage sometimes means standing up, not only to the enemy, but to the system itself. Diver Derrick's act of defiance wasn't rebellion. It was leadership, raw, instinctive, and born in the fire of battle. In that one moment, that one decision to take the hill changed the desert, changed the battle, and changed the war. By dawn at El Alamein, the dust had settled. German bunkers lay shattered across the desert, and the rising sun revealed a battlefield transformed. One hill, one patch of sand and rock had changed hands, and with it, the fate of a campaign. But for the men who fought there, it was more than just another victory. It was proof that courage and instinct could rewrite the rules of war. And at the heart of it all was one man, Sergeant Thomas Diver Derrick, the Australian who disobeyed orders and changed World War II. The legacy begins. In the weeks after the battle, word of Derrick's audacious assault spread through the Allied lines like wildfire. To the bureaucrats in Cairo and London, it was an uncomfortable story, a soldier ignoring command and being right. To the men in the trenches, it was the story they had been waiting for. Here was proof that initiative mattered more than paperwork, and that sometimes the front line understood the battle far better than those in polished boots behind the maps. British commanders privately admired him, Australian troops worshipped him, and even the enemy respected him. Captured German officers reportedly referred to him as the mad Australian who climbed the impossible hill. To them, he was not a reckless fool, but a reminder of what made the Australian so dangerous in North Africa: unpredictability, aggression, and unrelenting willpower. A new kind of soldier, the Australian Imperial Force had earned a reputation across 2 world wars, not for perfect discipline, but for effectiveness born of independence. They called it the Digger spirit, a mix of toughness, humor, and quiet defiance. Derrick embodied that spirit completely. He led not from rank, but from example. He fought not for medals, but for his mates. And his actions at El Alamein began to reshape how Allied leaders saw their men. Field commanders started encouraging more autonomy, allowing platoon leaders and sergeants to make tactical calls when the situation demanded it. In other words, the Allies learned to trust the soldier on the ground. Derrick's defiance had proven that bravery with judgment could achieve what rigid obedience could not. It was a quiet revolution in military thinking, one that echoed through the rest of the war. The Pacific Theater, the return of Diver Derrick. When the 9th Division returned home to Australia, they expected rest. Instead, they were sent straight into the jungle war against Japan. There, the terrain was different: thick vines, endless rain, and cliffs that rose like walls into the clouds. But the spirit was the same. At Saddleburg Ridge in New Guinea, Derrick found himself facing yet another impossible position. The Japanese had dug in high above, firing down on every approach. Other Allied units had been stalled for days. But Diver Derrick wasn't a man who waited for permission. Under a storm of bullets, he scaled the near vertical cliff himself, hauling grenades in his teeth, tossing them one after another into enemy bunkers. He destroyed 10 Japanese positions, almost single-handedly the same number he'd taken at El Alamein. When he reached the top, exhausted and bloodied, he simply said to his men, "Now that's the way to take a hill." For his actions, he was awarded the Victoria Cross, the Commonwealth's highest honor for valor. And so, the soldier who once broke orders became the soldier who defined courage. From rebel to hero, by 1944, Derrick had become a national symbol in Australia, a household name. The press loved him, the rough, speaking, fearless Aussie digger who could outfight the best of the British and outthink the Germans. He was invited to meet generals and politicians, but he remained unchanged, still the same straightforward man who preferred a beer with his men over a medal ceremony. When one reporter asked how it felt to be a hero, Derrick replied, "I'm no hero, I just hate leaving a job half done." That single line captured everything about him. He didn't see himself as exceptional, just someone who refused to stop when others did. The final mission, in 1945, near the end of the war, Derrick led his platoon during the Battle of Tarakan in Borneo. By then, he was a major celebrity, the man with two lives, some called him. But fame didn't change his nature. He was still the first to advance, the last to leave. During a nighttime assault on a Japanese position, he was struck by machine gun fire, 5 bullets tearing through his body. Even as medics carried him to cover, he continued shouting orders to his men. "Keep going, don't stop for me." He died a few days later, on May 24th, 1945. He was 33 years old, the same age as when he had defied orders at El Alamein, the measure of a man. In the years after the war, military historians debated his legacy. Was Derrick's defiance an act of reckless disobedience or genius battlefield intuition? The answer, most agree, lies in intent. He didn't defy orders to challenge authority. He did it to save his men and win a battle that couldn't wait. That difference is everything. Courage without purpose is chaos, but courage guided by conscience, that's leadership. And in that moment, on that hill, Derrick embodied what every soldier hopes to be: brave enough to act when others hesitate, and human enough to care when others calculate. The legend in history, today, Diver Derrick's name is etched into memorials across Australia. Schools, parks, and even warships have been named in his honor. His medals are displayed at the Australian War Memorial in Canberra, reminders of a man who broke the rules to do what was right. Modern military training often references Derrick's story when teaching initiative and small unit leadership. He remains a case study in how one soldier's instinct can alter the course of history. Without Hill 33, without that unauthorized assault, the timing of El Alamein could have changed. Rommel might have held longer. The Allied timetable from Tunisia to Sicily to D-Day might have shifted. It's not an exaggeration to say one act of defiance helped accelerate the end of the war. Thomas Diver Derrick wasn't just a hero. He was a lesson, a reminder that true leadership isn't about blind obedience, but about judgment, courage, and heart. He fought not for glory, but because he couldn't stand still while others suffered. And in doing so, he proved that sometimes disobedience is the most heroic act of all. When history tells the story of World War II, it often speaks of Generals Montgomery, Rommel, Patton, but real wars are won by the men who make impossible choices when no one is watching. Sergeant Thomas Diver Derrick was one of those men. His defiance wasn't a betrayal of command, it was a triumph of humanity. Because on that night in the desert, when orders said wait, he chose to act. And that choice made by one Australian soldier helped turn the tide of a world at war.